Hi and hello, watch fans, and welcome back to Chronopolis Radio with me, your friendly neighborhood watchmaker, Rob Nuts. I am joined today by our resident provocateur, David Vaucher, and I'm standing just 20 meters from the entrance to Chronopolis, and I'm about to go inside that fair, but we have yet more watch brands to discuss, and one of them is the French brand Depancel, and therefore I'm going to kick it over to David to introduce the brand for us.
Thanks very much, Rob. Bonjour tout le monde. Today we are talking three levels of some of my favorite things. We're talking watches, we're talking French watches, and we're talking motorsport-inspired French watches. Now, Depancel is a brand that, as I'm doing the math in my head, is old without being old. So basically less than, but still very close to 10 years old, which goes to show you how fast time goes and how fast it is felt. Time has gone over the last several years or so. Depancel was started in, I don't want to say the French Geneva because that sounds weird, but spiritually that's what it is. It was started and is established in a town called Besançon, which is not far rather from where Rob is standing right now. And it's where a lot of French brands and activities are based. I want to take this in a certain direction, Rob, because we could talk about watches. There are a couple watches I find really attractive. And there's one change to one particular line that I find interesting, but I actually want to talk more broadly about themed watches. So we know that there are certain brands that will start basically around a theme and they'll make that their identity. And you could do that, but the risk is that you overplay that. And the risk is that your watches just come out looking very kitsch. And I want to contrast that in this context with, let's say, Tag Heuer. So if you ask me the brands both most associated with motorsports, I'd say it's Rolex and Tag Heuer. Rolex really tends to be, to me, just one model, whereas Tag is the whole model line. And they actually grew up, if you can call it that, evolved around motorsport, around the mid 20th century. And so now we think of those as motorsport watches. Depancel, however, is a motorsport inspired line of watches that still manages to toe the line quite well. So, Rob, do you have any thoughts on that? This idea of inspired by versus associated with for a brand?
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting, isn't it? Because like another one we could pull in there it seems to now be driven by its own history is Omega with the Speedmaster, which is a watch which was not designed for space. In fact, it was designed for the track, ironically enough, but has become indelibly associated with exploration beyond our atmosphere. And it can get a little bit old sometimes, I think, in the minds of some people when you're repeatedly flogging the same ailing horse. But when it comes to tag, funnily enough, Scarlett and I had a conversation about this not so long ago on air about what Tag should be doing. And I was very keen to lean even further into its motorsport history and reject things like what's it called? Is it the Yachtmaster? No, not the Yachtmaster, the Regatta Timer or whatever the hell it is. It's beautiful. It's a lovely watch, but I don't think that it had any place in the collection. Now, when a brand is started with like a central vision like Depancel being so linked to motorsport at its core, I think you you have an advantage and a disadvantage. So you have the advantage of being able to clearly communicate what you are. It makes sense to people because you can tell the same story over and over again. But then you do somehow box yourself in. I think from a branding theory perspective, some people would say that that is a negative thing because you don't really want to limit yourself long term. But I disagree because we're talking about an extremely finite audience with the watch buying public. And we also only need to attract a very small percentage of that very small audience for a watch brand to be moderately successful. And I don't think Depancel has any ambitions to be the next Rolex. I think they have ambitions to make beautiful watches that they love, that express something that they're very passionate about, sell them at a very fair price, and to make a living living their passion, I would say. So I think that actually something like this works very nicely. Yes, the motorsport trope is, some could say, overdone, but there are a few things that apply so cleanly and easily to the watchmaking craft. How do you feel about a brand identifying so closely with one aspect?
It's double edged. Before I answer that question, though, I do want to go back on something I forgot to say in the intro, which is the name, and it does tie into what you said, Rob. So Depancel is actually a contraction of three different French watch car brands: Delage, Panhard, and Facel Vega, which are extremely deep cuts. Even more so if you're not in watches, but they ended up with this actually very quite nice sounding brand name, which does evoke motorsport, but also I think could work well if you just wanted to start any kind of watch brand, right? It has this like nice, just I guess European French consonants that would work well if they wanted to make divers or dress watches. So there is some freedom in the name to pursue other things down the line if they wanted to. But to your point, Rob, in terms of having focused on one thing, it's good if you're able to remix things many different ways, many different times. Because you can imagine if you come out the gate with a watch that has a lot of bright colors, like to go with Tag, but also to go with some of Depancel's watches. So the Allure is one of my favorite, and it's very evocative of mid-century liveries. So if you come out the gate with that, but you do it too much, and you tie yourself into those colors or that theme, it becomes very hard to then branch out, or at least do it in a way that seems original or that's not even more kitsch than what you started out with. So we're talking generally here because I think their watches are relatively restrained with their own specific design codes. But it will be interesting to see what they're doing in 5 or 10 years' time and how they've been able to kind of twist and remix that motorsport theme going forward.
I mean, as you said, they've been around for the best part of a decade already. And I remember when they first came out and in the same lane, on the same track. We can't get away from the puns, can we? It always seems to happen when we talk about motorsport brands. But they've kept on going because I think they have an audience that loves what they do. And, we talk about taste, right? We had this big discussion about it not so long ago about what's good taste, what's bad taste, what's personal, what's objective. And I think we came down with the idea that, well, there is really only personal taste. And we know full well that there is a demand for watches like this with these bright colors, with these exciting callbacks to, incredibly memorable track days, wonderful performances by the legendary drivers in the history of professional motorsport. And I've got a lot of time for it. And I agree with you that the Allure is my favorite model of Depancel's, to be honest. And I can't wait to actually get it on the wrist. It's kind of, it's teasing me being so close to the gateway of Chronopolis. I want to walk into this newly founded city and I want to strap that watch on my wrist immediately. And it'll be the first thing I do when I go through the door. But would you see yourself, or could you see yourself being, or imagine yourself, not personally, but like if you were a new collector who loved motorsport and you found this brand, could you see yourself becoming just a one brand kind of guy when it comes to something like Depancel?
Well, it's interesting. We've talked a lot about micro brands and the part they play in the watch industry. And up until now, my point of view has always been that's probably not going to be your first watch because you have to really be in the stream to know that these brands even exist. But as prices have increased on the more established brands, and as there are more and more forums for people to get in touch with these micro brands, right? Like Chronopolis being one of them. There's a very good case actually for these very much being your first watches, and this is probably a good time to move into their specific products. They're very well priced for what you're getting. When I'm looking at another one of my favorites, and Rob, I want to get technical in just a moment, but this is the Autosport, the blue silver edition. It's really nicely motorsport inspired without being something that's too on the nose. But what's interesting about it is that the Depancel actually, one of their first models, and this is the one that caught my attention, was it was a chronograph, and it was operated by the Seagull manual chronograph movement. I'm sure you know the one I'm talking about. But if I spoke to them at the We Love Watches show last year because it wasn't in the catalog anymore. And if I remember correctly, they said there just was no supply of the movements less. They were having trouble getting that supply. And so now what you end up with, so Rob, you'll see this when you go to the show, is an auto sport that has a mono pusher, but it's a Miyota 9122 movement, if that rings any bells to you. So it's actually a calendar watch. Like the two subdials are giving you the day of the week and the month. And so you end up with a watch that actually is probably more useful than a chronograph. It's got that mono pusher on it, so it still looks very motorsport inspired, but you're losing the chronograph functionality. So heads up to anyone that wanted that chronograph, you'll have to find it again. But to tie, I guess to tie up all of what I'm saying, totally legitimate first watch, very good price, really good functionality. And if this is what you're picking for a first watch, congratulations, you got something that's going to look good and be a conversation starter for the rest of your life, I think.
Yeah, what we're talking about here is £650 for this very beautifully styled and extremely authentic motorsport inspired watch. I guess the Seagull movements were all bought up by Studio Underdog because they probably have more of a desire.
I think you're joking, but maybe that's what happened. If I remember correctly, they just couldn't get the supply, and so they had to pivot to this other movement, which ended up looking really good.
It looks great. Yeah, obviously it fits the original design. The monopusher is a wonderful look and something I've got a huge amount of time for. It's a bit incongruous, perhaps, but like you say, it's probably more functional for most people on a day-to-day basis. And these movements, these basic calendar movements, they're too few and far between. You see, like a lot of micro brands or small independents, which I think you can probably call Depancel after nearly a decade in the game, using off-the-shelf calibers, be it Soprod, Lejeune Perret, Solita, ETA, and they tend to go for time only, maybe a date, maybe a day date, maybe if you're lucky a GMT, and beyond that, not much. And I remember when I was really early on in my career, I must have been in my late teens or early 20s, one of the watches I bought and loved more than anything was a gold-plated rotary. It had a moon phase, and I say that very loosely. It was as basic a moon phase as you can get, and it had two pushers, and it had a day and a date function on the dial. It could be adjusted by these pushers. Now, it's a rotary. It's extremely basic, but I felt like king of the world wearing this watch. I gifted it a few years ago to a friend of mine who didn't have a watch of her own, and she loves it. She wears it all the time and is fascinated by the subdials and the amount of information it can display and how easy it is to adjust. And so, yeah, I'm glad to see a movement like this Myota being used in a very accessible brand. And to talk a little bit about this first watch, second watch idea, it is interesting how we kid ourselves, I think, as people deep in the industry that, oh, you have to know about watches before you'll know about a brand like this. When you're so closely aligned to a world like motorsport, could be space, could be art, could be another kind of sport, I think it's possible people will find you through your non-watch advertising and come to you with cash in hand and say, this is the watch I like. I like it as a thing. I'm going to buy it without necessarily being into watches. Because it's a strange thing for a micro brand or a small independent to start a watch brand and position the price point around here, because this is clearly entry level. And when you're an experienced collector, although something like this becomes like an impulse buy, the question is, does the impulse still exist to sort of go down the food chain? If you're looking like, if you own like a Royal Oak, for example, yeah, you could afford to buy a Depancel, but would you? Like, why would you? Would you not put that 650 quid towards your next Royal Oak or your offshore or your Nautilus or whatever it is that you've set your sights on? So I think that a brand like Depancel opens the door to new collectors. I think that it is so militantly um, consistent with its communication that it is going to find that audience and it is going to cultivate a community that may not care about any other watch brand but does love Depancel. And so here we are, like 10 years or best part of 10 years into their existence. They're still going strong. And now they're one of the 20 brands that is making waves in Geneva.
I think with Depancel, you see some of the hallmarks I associate with French watchmaking, which are, what's the word? Design that is their own, unique sort of design that takes a stand in one direction or other, and good value. And just good value done well by serious people who care about what they're doing. So I would say that the one thing that maybe Depancel doesn't have is the huge marketing budget, obviously, of someone like a Rolex to go sponsor a racing series or something like that. So to your point, Rob, if someone discovers them, it'll probably be through an algorithm being pushed or the fact that they catch them in a magazine or something like that. But hey, that's how everyone started. Rolex was not Rolex forever. And so I would say that if somehow you're listening to this and this was pushed to you and you love motorsport and you want to check out something that will look good, just like Rob's Rotary, if you buy it today, it will still look good 20 years from now, even if you never buy another watch. It's motorsport without the kitsch. So if that aligns for you, then please absolutely check them out.
Yeah, you know what? I think this could be a great watch. It would be a watch that a father or a mother who's into Tag Heuer could buy for their child as their first watch when they're 18, because it's a smart piece. Everything in the collection is smart. They look beautiful. The Allure is the one for me, I think, still. I love the colorways. I love the layout of the dial. And it's just an extremely good value product that could really get someone down the rabbit hole of watches or even just be a lifelong companion. Because like you say, stuff like this, it doesn't really go out of style because it's just so in its own lane. It ages very gracefully. So let's wrap that up. I like the conversation. I like the brand. I can't wait to see it on the wrist. And here we are. It's all about to kick off right at the very cusp of the week-long activities. So I will say goodbye and hope you enjoy listening to the rest of the Chronopolis radio episodes that we're pushing out this week. There'll be 4 every day, 5 on the first day, including the episode that will have aired 38 minutes ago as of this recording, as we talk to Après Demand, the founding agency behind this incredible movement in the industry. David, thank you for your time. And to everyone listening, until next time, stay safe and keep on ticking.